This country's previous two Democratic presidents were white men who managed to win in part because they came from the South. And tonight, in our fourth story on the countdown, Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter are both now talking about their Southern perspective on racism, but reaching different conclusions about the role racism has played in fueling the small but intense opposition against President Obama on health care reform. The official White House line is that opposition to health care reform is based on policy disagreements, not on the color of the president's skin. But after a South Carolina Republican yelled, "You lie," during Mr. Obama's speech, a virtually unprecedented breach of protocol and its public disrespect for the president, some black leaders suggested the insult would not have occurred with a white president. And last week, former President Jimmy Carter of Georgia agreed and said some of the opposition to the president's efforts on health care is rooted in racism. Today, Mr. Clinton was asked whether he agrees with Mr. Carter's specific statement that, quote, an overwhelming portion of the animosity toward President Obama is racially motivated.
Here's how I would say it. I think some of the extreme right who oppose him on health care also are racially prejudiced. And if you listen to look at some of the signs or listen to some of the rhetoric, there's no question that that's true. But I believe if he were not an African American, all the people who are against him on health care would still be against him, because they were all against me too. He believes that. I sympathize with where President Carter's coming from. If you're a white Southerner and you've fought these battles a long time, you're super sensitive to any kind of manifestation of discrimination based on race. But what's driving the opposition to President Obama on health care is not race. Some of his opponents have racial discrimination in their heart, but that's not what's driving them. What's driving them is they don't want health care. They don't want the government one more time to take care of people who are left out and left behind. They're philosophically or emotionally or whatever opposed to it.
With us tonight is Professor James Peterson, Professor of African American Studies at Bucknell University. Thanks for your time tonight, Professor.
Good evening.
Professor, which one of our former presidents do you think is pointing us closer to the truth here?
That's an excellent question. I tend to side with and agree with more with former President Carter on this issue. Not that it's overwhelming, but that it's certainly worth us thinking about, and there's some serious things for us to consider when we see the kind of imagery, the signs, the language, and the vitriol that's been espoused around the country directed at President Obama. I think part of the question here is how do we figure out what the sum is, the S-O-M-E is, that President Clinton is talking about? How do we qualify that and how do we quantify that? And then I think we can rest a little bit easier about the conversations that we're having or not having about race in this country right now.
It seems to me President Clinton has a point in that the people who have racist tendencies would probably be heading in a more conservative direction on health care anyway, and they would probably oppose health care anyway. But wouldn't racism explain some of the energy, some of the vitriol, some of the incredibly over-the-top imagery that we have seen in this opposition to President Obama this year?
Racism certainly explains and describes some of it. Again, I think we need to measure what that sum is before we move on. But I think we also need to understand that President Clinton has a mission here. And essentially what he's doing is he's towing the line of the Obama White House, which is let's move this discussion or center this discussion around health care. Let's move away from race, because we all know that unfortunately race can contaminate and dominate the discourse in this country because of the long history that we've had, and we've tried to wrestle with these things and haven't really worked through them all.
And do you see it as more politically problematic for a black president to try to deal with this stuff in public statements than it would be for a white president?
Of course, yeah. Discussions around race are a lose-lose proposition for President Obama. Unfortunately, he will never really be able to politically satisfy certain communities, certain aspects of the black community, and certain folk on the left who really want to have an honest, constructive, open dialogue about race that we can't really have at this particular point, or we're not mature enough or ready to have. He can never satisfy them. And then on the other side, or the flip side of that, any time that he does enter into a discourse about race, some of his opponents opponents on the right will try to exploit that to continue to try to marginalize him and to fragment our communities so that we can't have the productive conversations about things on his platform, such as health care. So it's an extraordinarily complex moment. We felt as if we made such an aspirational jump in electing President Obama, but we really actually took a couple steps backwards in our ability or our lack of ability to have constructive conversations around race. And if you look at the different incidents over the course of the summer, including Gates and including even the Kanye West debacle a few weeks ago, it's very, very difficult for us at this particular moment to have constructive dialogues about race. I think Obama and the Obama White House understand that, and unfortunately, race has become one of these political footballs. It will get tossed back and forth, and it will be leveraged against President Obama in terms of what he's trying to accomplish on his agenda.
Now, given that during my lifetime alone, from President Nixon forward, there have been some incredible lies told publicly out of that White House, what was it like in the black community to have the first black American president up there on the podium, and for him to be the first one, when he's mentioning a provision in a health care reform bill, he's the first one in this forum ever to be called a liar by a member of Congress?
Well, it's stunning, it's startling, and disrespectful. A lot of my friends mobilized really, really quickly. We didn't even know who Joe Wilson was prior to that, but mobilized really, really quickly to find out how do we redress and readdress the situation. But I think what we need to understand is, depending upon where you live, what region of the country, what community in, depending upon your ethnic background, yes, that's going to inform how you're going to respond to certain situations. And so basically what we need to do is understand the complexities of our history in order to better grasp this particular political moment.
James Peterson, professor of African American Studies at Bucknell University, thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you for having me.